Miss Sharma, since you seem so disengaged in the back row, perhaps you'd care to enlighten the class with the solution to this rather trivial multivariable integration." Professor Alistair Finch's voice boomed across the lecture hall, dripping with a sarcasm so thick it was almost tangible. He gestured with a flourish to the impossibly complex equation sprawling across the whiteboard. Anya Sharma, 39, small and dressed in a simple grey cardigan, looked up from her meticulous notes, her expression calm. "Certainly, Professor," she said, her voice quiet but clear. A wave of snickers rippled through the hall. Even the teaching assistants exchanged pitying glances. Finch smirked, clearly anticipating her public failure. He had no idea the trivial problem he'd selected was a cornerstone of Anya's forgotten doctoral thesis. "If you believe true brilliance often whispers, not shouts," type quiet genius below. Anya Sharma was an enigma in advanced calculus 3. While most students were in their early 20s, bright-eyed and buzzing with academic ambition, Anya was older, quieter, her presence almost blending into the worn upholstery of the back row seats she invariably chose. She wore simple, unpretentious clothes, her dark hair usually pulled back in a neat bun, her demeanor one of focused, almost serene attentiveness. She rarely spoke unless directly addressed, her contributions concise and insightful, yet offered with such humility they were often overlooked. She took copious notes in a small, precise script, her fountain pen scratching almost silently. Other students, caught up in the competitive campus culture, mostly ignored her, pegging her as perhaps a returning student struggling to keep up, or maybe just an auditor with a peculiar fondness for higher mathematics. They couldn't have been more wrong. Anya had once been a rising star in theoretical mathematics at a world-renowned institute, her doctoral work on n-dimensional manifolds considered groundbreaking. But life, as it often does, had intervened. A family crisis, years spent caregiving, had pulled her away from academia just as she was on the cusp of a brilliant career. Now, with her obligations fulfilled and a quiet yearning to re-engage her intellect, she was simply taking classes, rediscovering the joy of pure mathematics without the pressure of publication or tenure. Professor Alistair Finch, on the other hand, was a well-established academic titan, a renowned mathematician whose early work had been genuinely brilliant, but whose ego had long since outstripped his recent contributions. He ruled his lecture hall with an iron fist and a silver tongue, delighting in intellectual intimidation, Socratic shakedowns, and the public dismantling of any student he deemed unprepared or intellectually lacking. He saw his advanced calculus class not as a place to nurture talent, but as a crucible to weed out the unworthy. Anya Sharma, with her quiet demeanor and back-row preference, had registered on his radar as a perfect target for a bit of morning sport, someone whose inevitable failure would serve as a useful object lesson for the rest. The problem Finch had scrawled across the entirety of the massive whiteboard was a beast. It wasn't just a complex multivariable integration. It involved nested integrals, trigonometric substitutions that led to elliptic functions, and a final step requiring a contour integration technique that was typically introduced only in graduate-level complex analysis courses. It was, for an undergraduate calculus class, deliberately and sadistically impossible. Designed to elicit panicked silence or, even better from Finch's perspective, a fumbling, incorrect attempt that he could dissect with surgical precision. He'd presented it with a flourish, then let the silence stretch, watching with amusement as brows furrowed, pens hovered uselessly, and a palpable sense of dread filled the lecture hall. "No takers?" he boomed, scanning the sea of intimidated faces. "Surely someone in this room, supposedly the best and brightest our university has to offer, can at least make a start. Or are we all content to be stumped by what is, in essence, a rather straightforward application of first principles?" His gaze, predatory and gleeful, settled on Anya Sharma in the back row. She'd been looking at the board, her expression thoughtful, a slight frown of concentration on her face, but no sign of the panic he usually enjoyed inducing. "Ms. Sharma," he called out, his voice laced with mock encouragement, "you seem to be pondering it with some intensity. Perhaps your quiet contemplation has yielded a path through this thicket." The class tensed. This was classic Finch, picking on the quiet one, setting them up for a fall. Whispers and stifled giggles rippled through the rows. Anya looked up, her gaze meeting Finch's directly. There was no fear in her eyes, just a calm, appraising look. "I believe I can attempt it, Professor," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed hall. Finch's smirk widened. "Attempt it? How very brave of you, Miss Sharma. Do please come down and share your attempt with us all. We await with bated breath." He gestured grandly towards the front, then leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, ready for the show. Anya rose from her seat, her movements unhurried. She walked down the aisle, a small, unassuming figure against the backdrop of the massive lecture hall. The only sound was the faint click of her sensible shoes on the linoleum floor. She reached the front, picked up a piece of chalk, and for a moment simply stood before the sprawling equation, her back to the expectant, mostly skeptical audience. Finch watched her, a patronizing smile fixed on his face. He was already formulating the cutting remarks he would use to dissect her inevitable errors. Anya took a small, almost imperceptible breath. Then her hand began to move. It wasn't the hesitant, uncertain scratching of a student guessing their way through. Her chalk strokes were fluid, confident, precise. She didn't start at the beginning as most students would have. Instead, she made a series of seemingly unrelated substitutions and transformations on different parts of the equation, her chalk dancing across the board with an almost hypnotic rhythm. She wasn't just writing, she was thinking in chalk, her logic unfolding visually. The initial snickers from the students died away, replaced by a puzzled silence, then by murmurs of dawning comprehension as the sheer complexity of what she was doing began to register. She wasn't following the standard textbook methods they had been taught. She was employing techniques that were far more advanced, more elegant, more direct. She used a Feynman integration trick to simplify one of the nested integrals, then a clever application of Green's theorem to convert a difficult area integral into a simpler line integral. For the final, most challenging part, the section involving the elliptic functions, she didn't even attempt the contour integration Finch had likely anticipated as the trick. Instead, she introduced a parameter, differentiated under the integral sign, a technique that made several graduate-level students in the room gasp quietly, solved the resulting simpler differential equation, and then integrated back, arriving at the solution with a breathtaking economy of steps. The entire process took her less than 10 minutes. The sprawling, intimidating monster of an equation had been elegantly, almost effortlessly slain. She stepped back from the board, placing the chalk neatly in the tray, leaving behind a cascade of perfectly legible, logically flawless mathematics. A profound, stunned silence filled the lecture hall. Students stared at the board, then at Anya, then back at the board, their minds struggling to process the display of sheer intellectual horsepower they had just witnessed. Professor Finch's jaw, which had been set in a smug line, had slowly slackened. The patronizing smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of utter, unadulterated shock. His face was pale. He pushed himself off his desk, walking slowly towards the whiteboard as if in a daze, his eyes tracing Anya's solution. He recognized the techniques, of course. They were advanced, some even esoteric, the kind of elegant shortcuts that only someone with a truly profound and intuitive grasp of higher mathematics would even think to employ, let alone execute flawlessly under pressure. He looked at Anya, who stood quietly by the lectern, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her expression serene. "Ms. Sharma," Finch finally managed, his voice a hoarse croak, a stark contrast to his earlier booming condescension. That was—" He struggled for words. "That was not the standard method. Where did you learn to approach an integration like that?" Anya met his gaze, a hint of a polite smile touching her lips. "It's a technique I explored during my doctoral research in algebraic topology at Cambridge, Professor, before I took a leave of absence. It often proves more efficient for certain classes of n-dimensional integrals. Cambridge, doctoral research, algebraic topology." The words hung in the air, each one a small bomb detonating Finch's preconceived notions. The quiet woman in the back row, the one he'd picked for easy sport, wasn't just a struggling returning student. She was a dormant volcano of mathematical genius. The students were now buzzing, whispering excitedly, looking at Anya with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The teaching assistants at the side of the room were staring at her as if she'd just performed a magic trick. Atticus Finch, no, Professor Alistair Finch, felt a flush of deep, burning embarrassment, followed by a wave of grudging, then overwhelming respect. He had tried to humiliate her, to make an example of her. Instead, she had, with quiet grace and devastating brilliance, made an example of him. Professor Finch cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the still charged atmosphere. "Cambridge," he repeated softly, more to himself than to anyone else. He looked back at the board, then at Anya. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a new, almost hesitant deference. "Ms. Sharma, your attempt was not just an attempt. It was a masterpiece of mathematical reasoning. The application of Feynman's technique was inspired, and your use of differentiation under the integral sign to bypass the standard complex analysis approach for that final stage was, well, it was frankly brilliant. Something I haven't seen done with such elegance outside of a handful of research papers." He paused, then added, his voice holding a new note of genuine intellectual curiosity. "Your doctoral work, was it related to Hodge theory by any chance? The specific parameterization you used?" Anya's polite smile widened slightly. "Partially, Professor. It focused more on the de Rham cohomology of singular spaces, but there were certainly overlaps with Hodge structures on Kähler manifolds." Finch's eyes lit up. For the first time in years, he felt the genuine thrill of encountering a mind that could not only meet his, but potentially surpass it in certain areas. He had, in his arrogance, almost missed it. "Singular spaces," he exclaimed, forgetting the class for a moment. "Fascinating. Are you familiar with Professor Witten's work on—" He caught himself, realizing he was about to launch into a high-level academic discussion in the middle of an undergraduate calculus lecture. He looked around at the sea of bewildered student faces, then back at Anya with a sheepish, almost boyish grin, an expression no one in that room had ever seen on him before. "Perhaps," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual volume but none of its earlier condescension, "perhaps Ms. Sharma and I can continue this discussion during my office hours. Or better yet, Ms. Sharma, perhaps you would consider co-lecturing a guest seminar on advanced integration techniques for our graduate students. Your insights would be invaluable." The offer was unprecedented. Our student, let alone one he had tried to publicly embarrass moments before, being invited to co-lecture a graduate seminar. The class was stunned into silence again, then a wave of applause, hesitant at first, then growing in volume, filled the hall. It wasn't just for Anya's brilliant solution, it was for the quiet, dignified way she had handled herself, and perhaps, a little, for the sight of the notoriously arrogant Professor Finch being so thoroughly and gracefully humbled. Anya Sharma simply nodded. "I would be happy to discuss it further, Professor," she said. She then quietly returned to her seat in the back row, the applause washing over her. She opened her notebook and prepared to take notes on whatever Finch would present next, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. The way her fellow students looked at her, the way Professor Finch now addressed her, always with a newfound respect, often with a genuine question seeking her opinion. Word of Anya's takedown, or the day Finch met his match, spread like wildfire across the mathematics department, then the wider university. Anya herself remained unassuming, declining offers for accelerated program completion or immediate doctoral reinstatement, content for now to simply re-engage with the subject she loved at her own pace. Professor Finch, however, was a changed man. The incident had been a much-needed shock to his system. He became a more patient, more encouraging teacher, his arrogance tempered by the memory of Anya Sharma's quiet brilliance. He started looking for hidden talent in the quiet corners of his classroom, realizing that intellect didn't always announce itself with bluster and bravado. Sometimes it arrived in a simple grey cardigan, sat in the back row, and, when called upon, could rewrite the entire board with breathtaking elegance. Because true genius doesn't need to be loud to be heard. It just needs the right problem and the right moment to reveal itself, leaving even the most arrogant in stunned, respectful silence. Subscribe to my channel if you believe quiet confidence is the ultimate power, and that underestimation is always a fool's game.